Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a single handshake in Beijing yesterday just rewrote the entire energy security strategy of North America? And what if I told you that the United States, despite spending decades and trillions of dollars positioning itself as energy independent, has just watched its most reliable supplier open a pipeline, figuratively, and soon, literally directly to its greatest geopolitical rival? For over a century, Canadian energy has flowed in one direction, south. It powered American factories during 2 world wars. It heated American homes through countless winters. It fueled American vehicles across millions of miles of highway. This relationship was so fundamental, so assumed, that American policymakers rarely even thought about it. Canadian oil and gas were simply there, as reliable as the sunrise, as permanent as the Rocky Mountains themselves. Yesterday, that assumption shattered. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in Beijing and signed a comprehensive energy cooperation framework with China. And in that moment, the United States lost something it didn't even realize it could lose: the guaranteed monopoly on Canadian energy exports. The headline is straightforward: Canada just secured China as an energy customer. But the implications are profound, complex, and frankly terrifying for anyone in Washington who understands energy geopolitics. Today, we need to examine exactly what was agreed to in Beijing, why it represents a seismic shift in global energy flows, and most importantly, why the United States should be deeply, profoundly worried. Because this is not just about barrels of oil or cubic meters of natural gas. This is about leverage, about security, about the fundamental architecture of power in the 21st century. Before we dive into the specifics, if you value analysis that connects the dots between energy policy and geopolitical strategy, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these critical insights every single day. Let's begin with a fundamental truth that has been obscured by decades of political rhetoric and energy independence celebrations. The United States does not produce enough energy to meet its own needs without Canadian supply. This is not a matter of opinion or political spin. This is arithmetic. The U.S. consumes approximately 19 million barrels of oil per day. That's not a typo. 19 million barrels every single day. To put that in perspective, that's enough oil to fill over 3,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools daily. The United States is the world's largest oil consumer by a considerable margin, representing roughly 20% of global oil demand, despite having only 4% of the world's population. Now, the U.S. also produces significant amounts of oil domestically. The shale revolution transformed America from a net importer to, at times, a net exporter of crude. Politicians love to tout energy independence, and there's some truth to the claim. But here's what those politicians don't mention, or perhaps don't understand. The type of oil matters enormously. American shale produces primarily light, sweet crude. It's high quality, low sulfur, and excellent for certain applications. But American refineries, particularly the massive refining complexes along the Gulf Coast, were built decades ago to process heavy, sour crude. These refineries represent hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment. You cannot simply retool them overnight to process a different type of crude. It would be like trying to run diesel fuel in a gasoline engine. The machinery is fundamentally designed for a specific input. Where does that heavy crude come from? Canada, specifically, from the oil sands of Alberta. Canadian heavy crude is exactly what American Gulf Coast refineries need. In fact, Canada supplies more oil to the United States than any other country, including Saudi Arabia, including any OPEC nation. We provide approximately 4 million barrels per day to American markets. Let that number sink in. 4 million barrels per day. That's more than 20% of total American oil consumption coming from a single source, Canada. But the dependence runs even deeper when we look at natural gas. The United States produces substantial natural gas from shale formations. However, regional demand patterns create fascinating dependencies. The American Northeast, states like New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, relies heavily on Canadian natural gas, particularly during winter heating season. The pipeline infrastructure runs north to south. When a cold snap hits, when demand spikes, Canadian gas keeps American homes warm and American businesses operational. For decades, this arrangement worked beautifully for the United States. They had a secure, stable, friendly supplier right next door. No tanker routes to protect, no Middle Eastern politics to navigate, no concerns about hostile governments or unstable regions. Just a peaceful border, and pipelines carrying reliable supply. American policymakers took this for granted. They assumed it would always be this way. They assumed Canadian energy would always flow south because, well, where else would it go? That assumption just died in Beijing. And the United States is about to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when you take your most important supplier for granted. Let's strip away the diplomatic language and examine exactly what Canada and China agreed to yesterday, because the specifics reveal a strategy that has been months, if not years, in development. The centerpiece of the agreements is what's being called an energy cooperation framework. This is not a single contract for a specific volume of oil or gas. This is a comprehensive architecture for long-term energy partnership. The framework establishes a ministerial dialogue, meaning regular high-level government meetings specifically focused on energy trade. It commits both countries to exploring opportunities in multiple energy sectors: oil, natural gas, nuclear power, and clean technology. Let's break down each component because they're all significant. First, oil. Canada holds the third largest proven oil reserves in the world, trailing only Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. But unlike Venezuela, which is in political and economic chaos, and unlike Saudi Arabia, which sits in a perpetually volatile region, Canada is a stable democracy with rule of law and transparent business practices. For China, which imports approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day to fuel its massive economy, Canada represents an ideal supplier: reliable, professional, predictable. The framework opens the door for Chinese companies to invest in Canadian oil production and for Canadian producers to sign long-term supply contracts with Chinese refineries. This is not hypothetical. This is not a distant possibility. Chinese state-owned enterprises have already expressed interest. The infrastructure to make this happen is being built right now, and we'll get to that in a moment. Second, natural gas. This is where the framework becomes truly transformative. Currently, almost all of Canada's natural gas exports flow to the United States. We are deeply integrated into American markets. But Canada is in the process of building massive liquefied natural gas export terminals on the Pacific coast. LNG Canada, a facility in British Columbia, represents a $14 billion investment. It will have the capacity to export approximately 14 million tons of LNG per year when it reaches full operation. Where will that LNG go? The framework signed yesterday makes it clear: Asia, China specifically. Chinese demand for natural gas is growing exponentially as they transition away from coal for environmental reasons. They need secure suppliers. Canada has the gas. We have the export terminals under construction. And now we have the bilateral framework to facilitate massive long-term contracts. The framework also covers nuclear cooperation. Canada is a world leader in nuclear technology, specifically CANDU reactor design and uranium production. China is building more nuclear power plants than any other country as part of their decarbonization efforts. They need uranium fuel. They need technical expertise. Canada can provide both. This creates yet another energy integration point between our two countries. Finally, clean technology. This might sound like a minor addition, but it's strategically significant. China is the world's largest market for renewable energy technology, for electric vehicles, for battery storage. Canada has critical minerals essential for batteries, for solar panels, for wind turbines. By including clean technology in the energy framework, both countries are signaling that this partnership is not just about fossil fuels. This is about the entire energy transition. This is about securing the resources and technologies that will power the 21st century economy. Now, here's what makes all of this so devastating from an American perspective. These are not short-term transactional agreements. The framework explicitly uses language about strategic partnership and long-term cooperation. In the energy industry, long-term means decades. When China signs a 20-year LNG supply contract with a Canadian producer, that's 20 years of gas that won't be available for American markets if supply gets tight. That's 20 years of Canadian producers prioritizing Asian customers over American ones. That's 20 years of reduced leverage for Washington over Ottawa. The United States just watched its energy security assumption evaporate. And the truly bitter irony is that American policy choices directly caused this outcome. Now, some of you might be thinking, this is all theoretical. Canada can sign whatever frameworks they want, but at the end of the day, the pipelines run south. The infrastructure connects Canada to America. Redirecting energy to China is logistically impossible, or at least prohibitively expensive. That would have been true 5 years ago. It's not true anymore. And that's what makes this framework so consequential. Canada has been quietly building the infrastructure to export energy to Asia for years. We saw this coming. We prepared. And now that infrastructure is coming online at exactly the moment when our relationship with the United States is most strained. Let's start with LNG. Liquefied natural gas is natural gas that's been cooled to minus 160 degrees Celsius, turning it from a gas into a liquid. In liquid form, its volume shrinks by a factor of 600, making it economically viable to ship across oceans in specialized tankers. This is how countries without pipeline connections trade natural gas globally. For years, Canadian natural gas producers wanted to build LNG export facilities on the Pacific coast. They saw the massive demand in Asia. They saw the premium prices Asian customers were willing to pay. But various regulatory hurdles, environmental reviews, and political obstacles delayed these projects. Meanwhile, the United States proceeded with its own LNG export build-out, constructing massive facilities along the Gulf Coast that now export American gas globally. Canadian producers watched this with frustration. We had the gas. We had willing customers in Asia, but we lacked the export infrastructure. That gap is now closing. LNG Canada, located in Kitimat, British Columbia, is under construction right now. When Phase 1 is complete, likely in the next 18 to 24 months, it will have capacity to export 14 million tons of LNG annually. To put that in perspective, that's enough gas to meet the annual needs of approximately 20 million homes. And this is just Phase 1. Expansion plans could double that capacity. Where will this LNG go? Japan, South Korea, and critically, China. These countries have already signed purchase agreements. They're committed buyers. The tankers are being built. The supply contracts are being negotiated. And the framework signed yesterday in Beijing just formalized Chinese demand for Canadian LNG at the highest levels of government. But LNG is only part of the story. There's also crude oil. Currently, the vast majority of Canadian oil exports flow through pipelines to the United States. But Canada has been working to change that. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which just completed despite years of political opposition and legal challenges, increases Canada's ability to ship crude to the Pacific coast. From there, it can be loaded onto tankers and shipped to Asian refineries. Is this economically competitive with just piping oil directly to American refineries? In a stable, friendly trade environment, probably not. Shipping oil by tanker is more expensive than pipeline transport. But here's the critical point. When the alternative is facing punitive tariffs, unpredictable policy changes, and political hostility from your largest customer, paying a bit more for shipping to reach a stable, appreciative customer becomes very attractive. Canadian oil producers have been running the numbers. They've been stress testing scenarios. And increasingly, they're concluding that diversification away from total dependence on American markets is not just desirable, it's essential for long-term business survival. The framework signed in Beijing gives them political cover and government support to make that diversification happen. There's also railway capacity. Canada has been shipping increasing volumes of crude oil by rail to coastal terminals. It's more expensive than pipelines, yes, but it's flexible. Rail can go anywhere there are tracks. And Canadian rail lines connect to Pacific ports where oil can be loaded onto tankers bound for Asia. The infrastructure of independence is real. It's being built. It's coming online. And the framework signed yesterday ensures that when Canadian energy reaches Asian markets, there will be eager Chinese buyers waiting. Now, here's where the strategy becomes truly sophisticated, where Canada's unique advantages create a competitive edge that the United States simply cannot match. It's about carbon intensity, about environmental credentials, about the new economics of energy in a climate-conscious world. Producing oil and gas requires energy. You need power to extract it, to process it, to refine it. Traditionally, that power came from burning fossil fuels, creating a carbon-intensive production process. But Canadian energy production, particularly in certain sectors, has a significant green advantage. Much of Canada's oil sands production uses electricity from the grid. And in Alberta, there's been a massive shift toward renewable power. Wind farms across the prairies, solar installations, and critically, hydroelectric power from British Columbia can be wheeled into Alberta. This means Canadian oil can increasingly be produced using low-carbon electricity. More importantly, Canadian natural gas production, particularly the gas destined for LNG export, is among the lowest carbon intensity gas in the world. The gas fields in northeastern British Columbia use modern techniques. The LNG facilities are designed with carbon capture. The entire supply chain has been engineered to minimize emissions. Why does this matter? Because the world, and particularly Europe and Asia, is implementing carbon border adjustments. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, is already beginning to roll out. In simple terms, this means that imported goods will face tariffs based on how much carbon was emitted during their production. Dirty energy will face penalties, clean energy will not. China is watching this closely. They're implementing their own domestic carbon pricing mechanisms. They're under enormous pressure, both domestically due to air quality concerns and internationally due to climate commitments, to clean up their energy supply. Canadian LNG, with its low carbon intensity, becomes not just competitive, but preferable compared to alternatives like coal or high carbon intensity gas from other suppliers. American LNG, much of which is produced using coal-fired power in the production process, doesn't have the same green credentials. This gives Canadian energy a premium in Asian markets, a competitive advantage that American producers cannot easily replicate without massive infrastructure changes. The framework signed in Beijing explicitly mentions clean energy technology cooperation. This is code for China recognizes Canadian energy as cleaner, and Canada recognizes Chinese demand for low-carbon supply. It's a match made in geopolitical heaven. And it's a match that excludes the United States, or at least puts American energy at a competitive disadvantage. So when people ask whether Canadian energy can really compete for Asian markets against Middle Eastern or American suppliers, the answer is increasingly yes, not just despite our higher production costs, but because our environmental credentials command a premium that offsets those costs. We're selling a cleaner product to customers who increasingly value that attribute. Now we come to the heart of the matter. Why should the United States be worried about Canada securing China as an energy customer? Some might argue this is good for America. If Canada is selling to China, that's more American oil and gas available for domestic use, potentially lowering prices. That's the superficial analysis. The reality is far more complex and far more threatening to American interests. First, leverage. Energy is not just a commodity, it's a geopolitical weapon, a tool of statecraft. When the United States wanted to pressure Russia, what did Europe do? They threatened to cut energy imports. When OPEC wants to influence American policy, what do? They adjust production to manipulate oil prices. Energy dependence creates political vulnerability. For decades, the United States had leverage over Canada because we needed access to American markets. If Washington threatened tariffs or regulatory changes, Ottawa had to listen because we had no alternative buyers for the vast majority of our production. That leverage just disappeared. When Trump threatens Canadian energy with tariffs, Canada can now credibly respond, fine. We'll sell to China. That's not a bluff. That's not posturing. That's a genuine alternative backed by signed agreements and infrastructure under construction. The balance of power in North American trade negotiations just fundamentally shifted. Canada is no longer negotiating from a position of dependence. We're negotiating from a position of options. And in any negotiation, the side with options holds power. Second, supply security. The United States currently enjoys stable, secure energy supplies from Canada. This is not a trivial advantage. Compare Canadian supply to alternatives. Middle Eastern oil requires protecting tanker routes through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow choke point that Iran has repeatedly threatened to close. Venezuelan oil comes from a collapsing state with unreliable production. Russian energy is obviously problematic given current geopolitics. Canadian energy is piped directly across a peaceful border from a friendly democracy. There are no tankers to protect, no hostile governments to negotiate with, no concerns about supply disruptions due to regional conflicts. This security has a value, an enormous value, that is rarely calculated into energy prices. But if Canadian producers increasingly prioritize Asian contracts, if they build their expansion plans around Chinese demand rather than American demand, U.S. supply security erodes. It doesn't happen overnight. But over a decade, over 2 decades, the United States could find itself needing to import from less reliable, less friendly suppliers to make up the shortfall. Third, and this is crucial, the United States is actively trying to decouple from China economically. This is a bipartisan priority in Washington. Republicans and Democrats agree that reducing American dependence on Chinese manufacturing, Chinese technology, Chinese supply chains is a national security imperative. Enormous amounts of money and political capital are being spent on this decoupling effort. But if Canada, America's closest ally and most integrated economic partner, is simultaneously coupling more deeply with China, the decoupling strategy fails. Canadian energy flowing to China means Chinese industry runs on secure, reliable fuel. Chinese economic growth continues unimpeded. The leverage America hoped to gain by restricting Chinese access to Western resources evaporates because Canada is providing those resources. Moreover, if Chinese companies invest in Canadian energy infrastructure, if Chinese state-owned enterprises own stakes in Canadian oil sands projects or LNG facilities, they gain indirect access to North American resources that the United States was hoping to deny them. This is strategic encirclement through economics. China does not need to challenge America militarily in the Western Hemisphere if they can achieve their objectives through resource partnerships with Canada. Fourth, refineries. American Gulf Coast refineries are specifically designed to process Canadian heavy crude. Billions of dollars of infrastructure investment are optimized for this feedstock. If Canadian supply is redirected to Asia, these refineries face a problem. They can try to source heavy crude from other suppliers, but options are limited and often more expensive or less reliable. Or they can undergo expensive retrofits to process different types of crude, which takes years and costs billions. Either way, American refining capacity becomes less competitive. This matters because refining is where much of the value added in the oil industry occurs. Crude oil is just the raw material. Gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, petrochemicals, these refined products are what actually power the economy. If American refineries become less competitive, if they struggle to secure optimal feedstock, the entire downstream petroleum industry suffers. Jobs are lost, trade deficits worsen, economic growth slows. Fifth, And this is the long-term strategic nightmare precedent. If Canada successfully diversifies away from dependence on American markets and energy, other countries will notice. Mexico might follow suit. American allies in other regions might question their own dependence on American markets and American security guarantees. The entire post-World War II order, where American economic dominance was the sun around which other economies orbited, begins to break down. This is not about one energy framework between Canada and China. This is about whether the United States can maintain its position as the indispensable economy, the market that everyone needs access to, the customer whose demands must be met. If medium-sized economies like Canada can successfully pivot away from American dependence, the American century ends not with a bang, but with a series of quiet bilateral agreements signed in capitals around the world. Here's what makes this situation so frustrating, so utterly avoidable, and frankly, so emblematic of deeper problems in American strategic thinking. None of this had to happen. Canada did not want to diversify away from American energy markets. It's expensive, it's complicated. It required years of infrastructure investment and diplomatic effort. We did it because American policy choices made it necessary. When Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, when he invoked national security provisions to justify those tariffs against Canada, one of America's closest allies, he sent a clear message. You cannot rely on us. We will change the rules whenever it suits our domestic politics. Your economic security is not our concern. When the U.S. attempted to kill the Keystone XL pipeline for domestic political reasons, despite Canada having followed all the regulatory processes, having made enormous investments based on the assumption of approval, it sent another message. Your investment in serving American markets can be wiped out by our political whims. When American politicians routinely describe Canadian trade practices as unfair, when they threaten to tear up NAFTA and USMCA, when they treat trade with Canada as a problem to be solved rather than a mutually beneficial relationship to be maintained, they create uncertainty, and uncertainty is poison for long-term business relationships. Canadian energy companies started asking themselves, can we build a business strategy around serving American markets if those markets might be closed to us by tariff or regulation with no warning? Can we invest billions in production capacity to serve American demand if that demand might evaporate due to political decisions in Washington? The answer increasingly became no. We cannot build a sustainable business on an unreliable customer. We need alternatives. We need diversification. We need to reduce our exposure to American political risk. And so Canadian companies, with the support of Canadian governments, both federal and provincial, began the long process of building those alternatives. Pipelines to the Pacific, LNG export terminals, tanker capacity, trade missions to Asia, bilateral agreements with China, Japan, South Korea. It took years. It cost billions. But it's happening. And yesterday's framework in Beijing represents the culmination of that effort. The United States could have prevented all of this with basic respect, with honoring commitments, with treating Canada as an ally rather than a supplicant. But they didn't. They chose to use trade as a domestic political weapon. They chose to view Canada through a lens of zero-sum competition rather than mutual benefit. And now they're discovering that their most reliable energy supplier has decided that reliability needs to be mutual, or it needs to be replaced with other partnerships. This is a lesson in how empires decline, not through military defeat, not through economic collapse, but through the slow accumulation of strategic errors, through taking allies for granted, through confusing dominance with leadership. The United States is learning that lesson in real time. And the teacher is Canada, the polite neighbor they assumed would always be there, always be compliant, always be dependent. Friends, as we close, I want you to understand that we are watching the energy map of North America being redrawn. For over a century, energy flowed south from Canada to the United States. That was the natural order. That was the assumption underlying all strategic planning on both sides of the border. That assumption is dying. In its place, a new map is emerging. A map where Canadian energy flows west to Asia. A map where Canadian producers have options. A map where the United States cannot take Canadian supply for granted. This new map doesn't mean Canadian energy stops flowing south. There's too much infrastructure, too much integration, too much mutual benefit for that relationship to end abruptly. But it does mean that relationship is now one option among several, rather than the only option. The framework signed yesterday in Beijing is not just about energy. It's about leverage. It's about options. It's about Canada refusing to remain in a position of structural dependence on a partner whose reliability has been called into question. This is a mature, sovereign nation making rational decisions to secure its own prosperity and security. Should the United States be worried? Absolutely. They should be worried about the erosion of leverage over Canada. They should be worried about supply security in a world where their closest supplier is building alternatives. They should be worried about the precedent of medium-sized economies successfully diversifying away from American market dependence. They should be worried about the unintended consequences of treating allies like adversaries. But most of all, they should be worried about what this reveals, that the assumptions underlying American power are not as solid as they believed, that economic dominance is not permanent, that allies, even the closest allies, have limits to their patience, and that the world is changing in ways that American policymakers seem unable or unwilling to recognize. Canada is securing its future. We are building alternatives. We are no longer willing to be a captive energy supplier. And the rest of the world is watching, learning, and perhaps following our lead. I want to hear from you. Do you believe Canada is making the right choice by diversifying our energy customers? Does this make us more secure, or does it risk our relationship with the United States? Share your perspective in the comments below. This is a decision that will shape Canadian prosperity for generations, and your voice matters. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're tracking these fundamental shifts in global energy and geopolitics every day, and your support helps us continue this important work. Friends, thank you for being here today. The energy map is changing, Canada is securing its future, and America is learning that even the most reliable partners will seek alternatives when reliability becomes one-sided. Thank you.